10 hard-belief facts about early UFCs. Since its inception in 1993, the UFC has advanced significantly. The UFC, formerly a brutal sport, is now a popular sport shown on major networks like ESPN. It's astounding how the activity that Senator John McCain once called human cockfighting has developed into what it is now. As diehard supporters, we frequently assume that we are well versed in the UFC and fighting industry, but rely on us. Even devoted UFC supporters won't be familiar with all the details of early UFCs. All of it will be shared in this video. No UFC fighters ever have died in the octagon. The fact that no UFC fighters ever perished in the octagon is the best place to start this list. This is excellent, but it could seem strange to the typical person who still views MMA as a blood sport, in which people die every Saturday in front of the television. However, MMA is one of the safest sports for training and competition. It is significantly safer than other combat sports like boxing or Muay. It is even more secure than certain popular sports including American football. Before the combat, some people died due to catastrophic weight reduction. However, there have never been any fatalities within the cage, and we hope there will never be. List of celebrities who own UFC shares. As previously said, UFC is the sport with the fastest global growth, and many wealthy people want to capitalize on this growth. In recent years, we have observed a lot of well-known individuals buying UFC stock to ride this increasing tide. Conan O'Brien was one of the early investors in the UFC, when it was still illegal in all 50 US states, but he's now getting a great return on his investment because he trusted the UFC. Other famous people who possess UFC stock include Ben Affleck, Tom Brady, Calvin Harris, Jimmy Kimmel, and more. And then there are more other celebrities like Maria Sharapova and her sister Williams. Who would you never suspect have anything to do with mixed martial arts? You can be the owner of the UFC gym too. Do you realize that you might own the UFC gym? You can buy a piece of the world's fastest growing sport if you have between $30,000 and $50,000 in startup fees and an expected investment of $100,000 to $2 million. The UFC is a very powerful brand that controls the MMA market. Purchasing their UFC gym franchise could turn out to be a wise investment. The UFC gym offers group and private lessons, and it doesn't just specialize in mixed martial arts. You can also take fitness classes there. Every gym has tons of heavy bags, mats, recent cardio, and strength machines, and much more. The highest ever attendance in UFC history was at UFC 243. The UFC has hosted numerous legendary events that set numerous records over the past years. They broke the live attendance record at Marvel Stadium in Melbourne, Australia, in 2019. Of course, we are referring to the legendary UFC 243 occasion, among the biggest in sporting history. Israel Adesanya defeated Robert Whittaker that evening, unifying the UFC's 185-pound belts in front of 57,125 spectators. The previous record, 56,214, was set at UFC 133 in the same venue when Holly Holm defeated Ronda Rousey. Dana White has never sold all of his UFC shares. The UFC was sold for an astounding $4 billion in 2016. The Fertitta brothers have quit battling to focus on other endeavors. Dana White, their business partner, had sold most of the stock for an amount we cannot calculate. He still holds several shares in the business and serves as president. Some MMA fans, especially the younger ones, have a tendency to believe that Dana White is the UFC's owner. Although he shared ownership with Fertitta brothers, who held most of the shares, White was never the sole proprietor of the UFC business. The owner of UFC is Endeavor. This may appear to be the most obvious thing that any MMA fan should be aware of at first. How many of you would know the answer though, if we asked you what is the name of the business that owns the UFC? And it's not a shame that most UFC supporters are unaware of the organization's leadership. This is primarily because you won't hear or see the moniker Endeavor at UFC events. I don't recall seeing or hearing them refer to the brand during the live show. Dana White is typically portrayed as the president representing the owners. But that's all. The UFC was purchased by Endeavor Group Holdings in 2016 for $4 billion. Additionally, the business represents the NFL and NHL and owns the Miss Universe. UFC Fight Night 55 and UFC 224 hold the record for most finishes. Fans of MMA enjoy bloody finishes. If you're like us, you must watch the UFC 224 and UFC Fight Night 55 matches because they had the most finishes. At FN55 and UFC 224, respectively, we saw 11 finishes out of 11 fights. Given that it had a 100% finish rate, UFC Fight Night 55 might be the perfect event for all bloodthirsty minds. 4 submissions and 7 KO TKO victories were witnessed. Luke Rockhold and Michael Bisping's fiercest rivalry also begins with this occasion. The UFC still does not offer all weight divisions. Since UFC is synonymous with MMA, many believe they created weight classes or rules. However, this is untrue because numerous regulating bodies are in charge of this. All or part of the guidelines and amendments these athletic commissions have issued must be followed by the UFC. There are a total of 13 weight classes under the MMA unified rules. There are 4 ladies and 8 males in the UFC. The UFC lacks 5 weight classes, if we restrict our attention to guys for a moment. The UFC is heavily investing in China. The UFC has started investing more and more in the enormous Chinese market in recent years. Although martial arts have a long history in China, MMA is still not as popular. However, a lot has changed with more Chinese fighters joining and succeeding in the UFC. The UFC inaugurated the biggest MMA training facility in Shanghai in 2019. We are referring to the cutting-edge 93,000 square foot facility that will be a hub for all Asian athletes and boxers. Its construction will set you back up to $13 million. This enormous building is 3 times as large as the UFC Performance Institute in Las Vegas. Think about that for a minute. This institute would help all MMA competitors, not only those from the East, prepare or advance. For example, it will aid Chinese athletes in their Olympic preparation. The UFC is defending itself from numerous lawsuits. Most MMA fans are unaware that UFC is facing numerous lawsuits, but neither the UFC nor the media ever mentioned this. Everything began in 2014 when Zuffa, the parent company of the UFC, was sued for antitrust violations by former UFC fighter Kung Lee and several other individuals. They contend that the UFC is an unlicensed monopoly that is driving out competing MMA promoters from throughout the globe. The UFC managed and lowered fighters' compensation in this way. When the complaint was granted class action status in 2020, 6 years later, everything reached a new level. This means that 1,200 athletes who competed between December 16, 2010 and June 30, 2017 are now included in the complaint. The UFC would be required to pay the fighters $5 billion if they lose the lawsuit. That is all for this video. We will be back soon with another informative video. Don't forget to like and share this video. Until next time.